for me, I find it more just exciting. And I'm thankful that we have that too, and that people have the opportunity to learn about this and to seek the truth and then find all this evidence that's been left behind. They can use that however they choose to, but I think that it makes such a compelling case for what we believe in, and we don't have to be always thinking, oh, is my faith based on reality, or is it just some fairy tale, or is it just what some pastor or my parents told me? No, it's been confirmed time and again by many different disciplines, and we can have full confidence that what's written there is true.
Welcome to Pass It On with Amy Warren, a podcast where we bring teens, parents, grandparents, and Christian leaders and thinkers to the table to discuss hard questions, find common ground, and pass on the historic Christian faith. Today, we are talking archaeology. Sir William Ramsay was born in 1851 to 3 generations of lawyers who taught him to be meticulous and careful in his chosen field of studies, namely history. He became a top British scholar and archaeologist studying in Scotland, England, and Germany, eventually being appointed Regius Professor by the monarchy. The academic circles at the time were dominated by the teachings of Ferdinand Christian Barr. His school, the Tübingen School in Germany, taught that the Apostle Paul was the author of maybe only 4 epistles that are attributed to him, and that the book of Acts, specifically authored by Luke, was written later and not exactly accurate. Ramsay was influenced by these ideas and was suspicious of Luke's accounts, believing the book of Acts to be a 2nd century work. In 1881 and 1882, Sir Ramsay traveled to Asia Minor, putting Luke's work in the book of Acts to the test. He stunned the liberal world of biblical studies by concluding that Luke was right. Not only that Luke was right, but that the gospel writer was a great historian. The scholar concluded this: I may fairly claim to have entered on this investigation without any prejudice in favor of the conclusion which I shall now attempt to justify to the reader. On the contrary, I began with a mind unfavorable to it, for the ingenuity and apparent completeness of the Tübingen theory had at one time quite convinced me. It did not lie then in my line of life to investigate the subject minutely, but more recently I found myself often brought in contact with the Book of Acts as an authority for the topography, antiquities, and society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne upon me that in various details, the narrative showed marvelous truth. And about Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke, Ramsay wrote, Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, he is possessed of the true historic sense. In short, this author should be placed along with the greatest historians. And so more than 140 years and thousands of archaeological discoveries later, the Holy Spirit that influenced the biblical authors continues to show that he is indeed trustworthy. And so our guest today is Dr. Titus Kennedy. We are going to be talking to him about the field of biblical archaeology, what it contributes to the Christian faith, and some of the fascinating archaeological finds that he outlines in his newest book. Let's meet Dr. Kennedy and learn a little bit more about him and his work. Dr. Titus Kennedy is a practicing professional field archaeologist, working primarily with sites and materials of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world. He has been involved in excavations and survey projects at several archaeological sites in biblical lands, including directing and supervising multiple projects spanning the Bronze Age through the Byzantine period. And he has conducted artifact research at museums and collections around the world. He is a research fellow at the Discovery Institute, teaches as an adjunct professor at Biola University, and has been a consultant writer and guide for history and archaeology documentaries and curricula. He publishes articles in the field of biblical archaeology and history, and recently wrote the book Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, outlining the archaeology and history of Christ and the Gospels. Dr. Kennedy, welcome.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we're so excited. We met at the Marriage Family Life Conference, and I met your lovely wife as well, Lucy. So we appreciate your time there, and I know that our teens really enjoyed your session. It was a really good time of Q&A afterwards. They were just so captivated by your content that Q&A time, I think, went really well.
Yeah, I agree. They had a lot of great questions.
So, Dr. Kennedy, what is archaeology?
Well, archaeology comes from two Greek words and essentially means study of the ancient, but archaeology as a discipline in the modern world involves excavation of ancient human civilizations. So we're digging up cities. It differentiates from paleontology, which focuses on things like dinosaurs and other ancient animals. We're looking at ancient cities. We do surveys to discover where these sites might be. Then we excavate. Then we analyze the materials in the lab and finally get to the publishing stage so that people can read about or see these artifacts. Archaeology really is the basis for much of our history today, because if we don't have these ancient sites, we don't have these artifacts, these inscriptions, then everything that we have to rely on is just what was written in the past and handed down. Now, that of course is very valuable, but if we only had those ancient documents, then we'd be missing a lot of information. So archaeology can help us fill in the gaps. Oftentimes, new ancient manuscripts are discovered too that we never had before, or that are older versions of copies we had. And then it also helps us to clear up some disputes about history. If people say, oh, I don't think this event happened, or I think it happened a little differently, or in a different time, or something like that, or this person didn't exist. Oftentimes, archaeology clears that up, confirming that these people and places existed, or in some cases, it shows perhaps that the way that a certain ancient culture wrote things wasn't exactly how it happened.
Now, because we're talking about the archaeology of the Gospels, what are the Gospels?
Gospels are the 4 books of the New Testament that focus on the life of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And biblical archaeology as a whole is a branch of archaeology. There are many different branches of archaeology. So biblical archaeology, of course, focuses on archaeology connected to the Bible. We're zeroing in specifically on the Gospels, the 4 Gospels part of the Bible. And so this archaeological material would focus on what we call the Roman period. And even more specifically, we're looking at the 1st century. And the 1st century primarily in what was called Judea province.
So let's start with a couple of objections, of common objections. First, many of our teens are going to get their ideas from social media. And not just social media, but documentaries that are popular around Christian holidays, and even some college classes nowadays, where they will commonly hear the claim that Jesus never actually existed. Now, as a scholar, how do you respond to that? And what does scholarship in general say about the existence and life of Jesus?
Well, we could go to ancient historical sources outside of the New Testament, sources from the 1st and 2nd century, so contemporary with Jesus and just after his time. And we could look at people who had a variety of different beliefs, different religious beliefs. And we see in these writings that there are several sources which mention Jesus as an historical person and also give us some information about his life. These range from Roman polytheists to Jews to Christians who recorded history outside of the New Testament. So most of the sources are actually non-Christian, and probably the most famous of these would be people like Josephus or Tacitus. These give us evidence from an ancient historical perspective that not only did Jesus exist, but he was actually quite well known in antiquity. And we could even reconstruct major events in his life from these various sources. Things like his birth and the idea of the virgin birth, the flight to Egypt, that his father was a carpenter, that he had disciples and he was known as a teacher and a wise man, and that he was known for performing miracles. And then he went on trial before Pontius Pilate and was crucified and died. And then that there were reports of his resurrection, and his disciples continued to follow him. So all these major events, besides Jesus himself, are attested by several historical sources.
And so, outside of the mainstream, this idea that Jesus never existed isn't really a scholarly belief or idea.
Correct. Within the community of scholarship that specializes in this period, the Roman period, or biblical archaeology, or archaeology of the Roman world, ancient history, etc., none of these scholars believe that Jesus didn't exist, because they're aware of this overwhelming evidence for the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. Yet there is a variance within scholarship as to how reliable different people consider the Gospels to be, how historically reliable. So while they accept the basics of Jesus existed, many scholars, modern scholars, they dispute a lot of material in the Gospels themselves.
Okay, so the next objection. Just because archaeology confirms people and places in the Bible, it doesn't make it true. So, for instance, comic books and other sort of fictional tales use real people and places in their stories as well, right? And so, how do you respond to this objection?
So, if we're just looking at the Gospel specifically, we could talk about the Spider-Man fallacy, as it's sometimes called, which is if a place, or excuse me, if a story is set in a real place, that doesn't mean that it's a true story. Example is Spider-Man is set in New York. Spider-Man himself is not a historical character. So we look at the Gospels, and there's Jerusalem, there's Bethlehem, there are all these different places that are real places. And yet we could say, okay, the places are real, but how do we know the stories are real? Well, we have to go into further details on that. And some of those further details are the people. So historical fiction doesn't always include historical characters. Sometimes there are some, but you're going to be able to find people who don't fit, people who are a made up character, or who are a combination of multiple historical people that they put in sort of an archetype. But if we look in the Gospels, just on this perspective, say in the trial of Jesus, we have all these different people that are mentioned in the trial of Jesus. We have Annas, who was a former high priest. We have Caiaphas, the acting high priest. We have Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. We've got Herod Antipas, who was the local ruler of Galilee. We have Peter, who plays a small part in the trial. He's out there listening. We have Simon of Cyrene, who carries Jesus's cross after the conclusion of the trial. And we have Jesus himself. So all of those characters are confirmed archaeologically, not just by historical sources. So we differentiate, as a side note, we differentiate a bit between ancient historical texts and archaeological material. Sometimes they can cross over, like if an ancient manuscript is found in an excavation or something like that. But we have inscriptions, archaeological inscriptions, from coins, from stone monuments, burial boxes, and so forth that attest to all of these people we just named. So all those details are correct, their titles are correct, their timing's correct, and so forth. So we're getting the impression that this story looks very historical. It talks about specific buildings, not just cities. So buildings that actually existed, not a made up newspaper or media company. It's got the Praetorium in Jerusalem. It's got the pool of Siloam and the pool of Bethesda and so forth. All these specific locations within Jerusalem, as one example, that are real. So all this has a ring of historicity. But then the next layer of that, beyond the places and the people, is the events themselves. So what can we say about the events themselves? In this type of thing, we sometimes confirm it through archaeology. Other times we have to look back at these ancient historical sources. Well, some of these writings from the 1st and 2nd century, they note the trial of Jesus before Pontius Pilate and that he was crucified. So we have the events themselves also attested. And, of course, the trial is just one example in the Gospels. But this is why we can look at the Gospels and say, these are historical documents. They aren't fiction. They aren't myth, because people, places, and events, all the specifics are confirmed. We don't find these fictional or made up or combined characters. We don't find places that sort of seem like they're correct to the time period, but they didn't exist. What we do find is we find things continue to match.
That seems to be the general consensus, right? That the Gospels are in a particular genre that shows that the Gospel writers who were writing them believed that they were writing what they were actually witnessing.
Yeah, we can go to the Gospels themselves to see that. The beginning of Luke lays out his methodology for the Gospels, and he says that he investigated everything very carefully. He used multiple eyewitness accounts, and he wrote it down in chronological order. And he says that his objective is that so you may know the exact truth about what happened. So that's his objective. He's telling us at the very beginning up front that he's not writing myth, that he's not writing a fable or an allegory. He's writing real events of what happened. And then, of course, we can see if archaeology confirms that or not, but that's his objective. John says something similar near the end of his gospel, basically that he was there and that he affirms that these things are true that he wrote. And then Peter says something in 2nd Peter that he was an eyewitness, he and others, and that they didn't follow cleverly devised myths about Jesus, about the content of the Gospels. And of course, Peter was one of the disciples. Peter was there. And from early church writings, we know that Peter was the source for the Gospel of Mark. So we have essentially 3 of the Gospels being called out as this is history, or at least they're claiming this is actually what happened. And our objective is to tell you accurately.
And I have a couple of quotes here. One scholar says, I do not think it is now possible to deny that the Gospels are a subset of the broad ancient literary genre of lives, that is biographies. And that's Graham Stanton of Cambridge University. Another one is this quote: while biography tended to emphasize encomium, or the one-sided praise of the subject, it was still firmly rooted in historical fact rather than literary fiction. Thus, while the evangelists, meaning the gospel writers, clearly had an important theological agenda, the very fact that they chose to adapt Greco-Roman biographical conventions to tell the story of Jesus indicates that they were centrally concerned to communicate what they thought really happened. And that was David Ahn, American New Testament scholar.
Yeah, I would say it's the majority opinion within scholarship that the Gospels are some type of historical biography. The variance within scholarship comes more within which of the details are true and which are false. So you have some scholars, of course, like myself, who would say these details are all accurate, and you would have others who would say there's a core of history with some mythology or fiction or embellishment, and then you'd have others that would say, oh, there's only a few historical details in there, and the rest of it is made up. But again, we can often go to the external evidence, like archaeology, to confirm what is accurate and how reliable are the gospels. We're never going to find everything archaeologically, so we can't expect that every single verse or passage in the gospels is going to be confirmed by some archaeological find. But we have found an immense amount of material, actually astonishingly amount of material, confirming so many different passages within the four gospels, that I think it's beyond the shadow of a doubt that we can say from a historical and archaeological perspective that those are reliable documents.
That's awesome. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth when we get to talking a little bit more about your book, about what those archaeological finds are specific to the Gospels and the life of Christ. But so the Gospel writers, I think we've pretty much come to the conclusion, wrote in such a way that they were trying to communicate that which they believe actually occurred. And the broad message is basically that Jesus is the Son of God, that he entered time, took on human flesh and human nature. He lived a sinless life, was crucified to pay the debt that humanity owed because of our rebellion of sin, that he died as a result of that crucifixion, and that he rose from the dead in victory over sin and death, satisfying the wrath of a holy God. Basically, the message of the gospel. And that sinners who choose to repent from their sins and surrender to the Lordship of Christ are reconciled to the Father. And this decision is evidenced by their desire to follow and obey the teachings of Christ in the scriptures. So this is the message, like I said, of the Gospels. The main subject is the person, the life, and the acts of this man called Jesus. Jesus's life is not the only one that has been confirmed through archaeology. An article from the Biblical Archaeological Review came up, an article 3 days ago, titled 53 People in the Bible Confirmed Archaeologically.
Yeah, I've read that article. It's, I think, a great example of the many details that the Bible has confirmed through archaeology in one subject subset, and that is people and their specific titles, positions, places of origin, or professions. And personally, I think that we have probably over 100 people that are confirmed archaeologically through the Bible, and that is going to be the subject of a future book for me. But this is just one category that can break it down for people to show that here's the type of details that we have confirmed archaeologically. We can do places, we can do people, we can do events, or you can just work your way through a story chronologically and look at all the evidence like we could do with the Gospels.
That's fascinating. So you think there's double that almost?
Yeah, and I think that we'll continue to find more and more. So the part of that would be dependent on the criteria that people look at, and also if you included some possible attestations. So we have names and inscriptions sometimes that it looks like it could be a person that's mentioned in the Bible, but we don't have enough details in that inscription perhaps to say with certainty. So if we included some of those more tentative ones, the number grows substantially. And then there are others, I think, that that are disputed by certain scholars just because they may have a different view of timing or chronology, or where to situate a certain character. But yeah, we've got a lot, and over 50 for sure, probably 100 plus.
Wow. So the ones that make it on the actual review article would be ones that are probably more widely accepted. And so they
Yeah,
probably go ahead.
yeah, widely accepted. And I would say maybe even widely known in some cases, because I think that there are several that could be added even to an article like that we could say they're confirmed, but they aren't included in that for whatever reason.
That's fascinating. That's cool. I'm glad I brought that up. Okay. You open your book, and if I may, I'm going to read just the first paragraph of the introduction to your book. It says, Jesus of Nazareth is widely acknowledged as the most important and most famous figure in history, regardless of beliefs about God, religion, the Bible, Christianity, or the church. Even before researching, analyzing, and evaluating the prolific archaeological and historical material connected to Jesus and the Gospels, one must realize that the effect Jesus had on history over the last 2,000 years has been immense. Since the dawn of civilization until the present, no other person has had a more significant impact. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Is the best way to study history is to look at primary sources? Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Primary sources, which would include both ancient historical texts, which generally those copies are going to be from much later, maybe 1,000 years later in some cases, but and the archaeological material that would also be a primary source, whether it's the ruins of a building or an inscription or something else.
Gotcha. Now, one objection to considering the Bible as a primary source is that it is considered because it's a religious text. Can you talk about why this is not accurate and maybe some other sources outside of the Bible or extra biblical texts that you mentioned earlier that exist that confirm the historicity of Jesus?
Sure. So if we only go back to the ancient world and look at all the sources around the time of the New Testament and around the time of the Gospels, you can't get away from something that can be called a religious text in some way, because there's a religious belief that's underlying everybody's writing at that time. Now, today we have the same type of thing, worldview. We might call it worldview. But if we're looking at any of these ancient historians, they all have various religious beliefs, and they're not secularists of the modern scholarship type. They're not humanists. They're not agnostics or atheists. They believe in different gods. So some of them believe in Roman gods. In fact, a lot of them do, because we're looking at the Roman world. Some of them have some other viewpoints, but in the back of my book, I have listed these sources and quotations from various first and second century authors who mention Jesus in their writing. And I start with Josephus. So what were Josephus' views, and how is he different from the Christian authors like Luke? Well, he wasn't a lot different in many ways. Josephus was a Jew, so he had specific religious beliefs. Some crossover, obviously, with Christians, believing in a one God and the Old Testament, but he had some differing views, especially then about Jesus and the Messiah. But he was writing as a historian, just as Luke was doing so. So Josephus has a religious bent, if you want to call it that. The next one we look at is Tacitus. So he was a famous Roman historian, the first century and into the second century. Well, he, like most Romans at that time, was a polytheist who believed in the Roman gods. So he also had a religious bent. And then next we have Suetonius, who's another Roman historian. He's going to have the same worldview as Tacitus, more or less. And then we've got Pliny the Younger, again, a Roman, Lucian of Samosata. So again, he's a polytheist. We have Celsus, who was actually very hostile towards Christianity, once again, a polytheist. And yet he acknowledges the existence of Jesus and details of his life. Thallus is the next one that I put in there, and he's actually recorded in a secondary source, who was Julius Africanus. That was a Christian, but should we just throw that out because of his beliefs? Well, if we do that, we're basically throwing out everyone. Serapion from the first century, who refers to Jesus. He's a polytheist philosopher. And then finally, we've got, two more. Justin Martyr, who was a Roman polytheist that converted to Christianity. And then we have Galen of Pergamon, and he was not a so strictly the same as some of these other Romans. He would have had more Hellenistic influence, but again, a polytheist. And then the Mishnah we could also put in there too, which of course is a ancient source of ancient Judaism. So we're looking at a variety of different religious backgrounds and beliefs for these authors. So if we just say that any document that has religion mentioned in it or is written by a person with a religious background, if we disqualify that, then we're throwing out all of our ancient sources. And realistically, we're throwing out all of our modern sources too, because everyone has some kind of worldview and belief in something. So if we're applying a equal criteria across the board, then we can't just discard the Gospels as a historical source. We can say we'll evaluate them based on other historical sources and based on archaeology, and we'll see what we can confirm, and if they're demonstrated to be reliable by external evidence outside the gospel writings themselves. But it's not objective to just throw out the gospels themselves. Why target only this one belief system? It's not fair. It's not just. It's not objective.
Wow, that is really interesting, just the way you put it and how much information you provided there. So it just really is not a rational thing. It's not an intellectual thing. It's not using reason to throw out the biblical text simply because it is a religious text and not consider it a primary source.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. And I mean, if we're talking about sources for Jesus, and scholars acknowledge Jesus was a historical person, our primary sources are the four Gospels in the New Testament. By far, the most information about Jesus comes from those. So we can't throw those out, or it wouldn't be wise or rational to do so, and then try to reconstruct Jesus from things that we just sort of make up or pop into our head based off of some tenuous material. Oh, I found some potsherds in Nazareth, and I'm going to construct a whole narrative about Jesus because of that. I mean, there are scholars who have tried to do that, but it doesn't make sense. We've got to look to our primary sources.
Okay, so let's get into some of the content that you highlight in your book. 800 years before Jesus was born, the prophet Micah wrote this: "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." 700 years before Jesus' birth, the prophet Isaiah wrote this: "Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel." What are some of the archaeological discoveries that corroborate the gospel accounts of specifically the birth of Christ?
Well, first of all, Bethlehem is a real place, but it was a tiny village. So it's not really the type of place that you would put the birth of some great figure if you were trying to build them up and create this fictional or mythological narrative. It was a little tiny village south of Jerusalem, and it was insignificant except for the fact that David had come from there. Nobody else though. And it was, I would say, virtually unknown in the Roman world prior to the life of Jesus. But did it exist? Was it there during the time of Jesus' birth? Yes, but we only actually discovered archaeological evidence for that fairly recently, so we had to take the Gospel's word on that. There were scholars who objected to the idea that Jesus was born in Bethlehem based on the allegation that we had no evidence for the existence of Bethlehem in the first century. Well, now that has been confirmed due to some excavations there. But in addition to Bethlehem's existence, we have a ancient tradition and architectural remains connecting to the birth of Jesus. So if we go outside of the New Testament, we find in some early sources that it's recorded Jesus was born in a cave in Bethlehem. And you read the Gospels and you understand that where he was born is the place where the animals were kept. Well, if we go to the ancient context, we find that people often kept their animals overnight in caves underneath or adjacent to their houses. Sometimes they built animal pens, but there's caves in the area, it's already a shelter that's there for you. So there was this ancient tradition of the cave that Jesus was born in that Christians had remembered and passed down in this tiny little area. And eventually, the Romans in the early second century, around 130 AD, they found out about this. An emperor by the name of Hadrian, and he launched a campaign to try to either erase the sites associated with Jesus, historical locations, or to Romanize them, paganize them by associating them with Roman gods. So he had a shrine to Adonis built over the cave where Jesus was born. He also had various pagan shrines and temples built over other places, like the pool of Bethesda. He had a temple to Asclepius, the healing god, built there. At the tomb of Jesus, he had a double temple to Jupiter and Venus built there, and so forth. So we know that he tried to do this over places associated with Jesus. So it's something that lends credence to the site being correct. Certainly Bethlehem, the village itself. And then later on, once Christianity became legalized, the Christians, by order of Constantine, built a church over this birth site and many, many other sites connected to Jesus. So we have a good amount of evidence from archaeology that Jesus was born right there in Bethlehem. And then we even have another ancient source, this Roman source, Celsus, from the second century, who is attacking Christianity, but he knows about Jesus being born, he says, in a certain Judean village. All right, so why is that significant? Because many scholars who said that Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem, they say, oh, he was born in Nazareth. That's why it's called Jesus of Nazareth. They say Bethlehem wasn't around at that time. But Celsus says a certain Judean village. Well, Nazareth was in Galilee. So he knows that it's a place not in Galilee. He knows it's not Nazareth. So he is leading us towards the Bethlehem conclusion. So overall, I would say we have good evidence for the existence of Bethlehem and the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem at the end of the first century BC.
Now, is there any dispute on the place of birth? Now, I know there are some disputes on some other locations in the life of Christ, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But is there any dispute on the location of his birth?
Well, there aren't really other proposed locations other than a few scholars who have claimed that he was born in Nazareth, which I don't think is even tenable anymore, even plausible. But there aren't other birth sites. There aren't other ancient locations that people were claiming was the birth of Jesus. So we really just have that one.
Cool. Well, 800 years before Jesus was born, the prophet Hosea wrote this: "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Matthew refers to this in chapter 2. And in chapter 2 of your book, titled Flight to Egypt, Herod, and Return to Nazareth, can you tell us a little bit about what we see in the archaeological records that lends to the credibility of the story of Jesus's life during this time?
Well, first of all, the overall setting of that part of the story makes a lot of sense because they're trying to escape King Herod the Great. So they don't want to stay in Herod's kingdom, which Egypt obviously was not part of. But they also would not want to go to a place where Herod had a lot of allies and influence. So if they went east or south, say into the Nabatean kingdom, the areas of Edom and Moab, that's where Herod came from. He had family there. So he has influence there also. And it's actually outside of the Roman Empire. So for some further complications, if they went north into Syria, that was directly connected to Herod's kingdom. It was the closest Roman jurisdiction that dealt with things in Judea. So Egypt was the other place bordering Herod's kingdom that they could go to. Well, Egypt was also in the Roman Empire, so there's easy and safer travel, and they can use the same currency, the same language. And Egypt also had a very big community of Jews going back to ancient times, going back really to about the time of the Babylonian exile, for sure, when there was a large contingent. Jeremiah, for example, went down there. So they can get into a community, they can use the same money, the same language, they can travel there safely and easily, and yet it's out of Herod's immediate influence. Egypt was ruled directly by the governor, so Herod would have to go, by the emperor, so Herod would have to go and talk to the emperor about that. He couldn't just go to the governor locally in, say, Syria province to the north. So it makes sense. It was a good choice based on the historical context. But beyond that, what we have are a couple of things from archaeology and ancient history. We do have a few sites archaeologically that have ancient traditions as Jesus and his family were here, but there are multiple locations. So we don't know, which is the correct one, or if maybe they moved around a bit. But we do have some ancient traditions that at least points towards people believing in the distant past that Jesus was there. We have a very important ancient historical source, again from Celsus, who I mentioned earlier, who was attacking Christianity, but he knows that Jesus went to Egypt as a child. And he actually explains from his perspective that that's how Jesus was able to perform miracles, because he says while Jesus was in Egypt, he learned magic from the Egyptians, and then he went back to his own land and performed these miracles. So we have additional corroboration outside of the Gospels for even that small part of the story.
So, chapter 4 of your book talks about Jesus' teachings, his travels, and his miracles. How does archaeology corroborate these, and specifically Jesus' miracles? Because you don't think miracles could be corroborated by archaeology. Like, that doesn't, in the average person's mind, it's like that's not something that you can prove through evidence as a miracle. But you have a chapter on this, and what is your insight on that?
So we can't reproduce miracles, obviously, and they didn't have video back then, although I don't think that would make one bit of difference, because if we recorded somebody performing a miracle today, everyone would just say that it was AI or CGI. But what we have, I think, is actually better than video evidence. We have eyewitness accounts. So anybody, you can doctor video, of course, right? And you don't have to believe it. Nobody saw it because it didn't actually happen. But if people are there and they're saying that it happened, that is stronger evidence than a modified video or some CGI. Well, in the ancient world, people didn't have, or very few people at least, had a scientific materialism worldview, which is pretty common in the West today, that the supernatural doesn't exist or that miracles are impossible. Of course, if God exists, then miracles are possible. So people have got to grapple with that. But in the ancient world, we do have people who witnessed these miracles of Jesus. Of course, we have this in the Gospels and the New Testament, but going outside of that, we have various sources who talk about the miracles of Jesus, and they all talk about them as if they happened. There's no objection to them, but there are different explanations as to where that power came from for Jesus to be able to perform those miracles. So if we go to Celsus again, for example, Roman source, polytheist, didn't like Christianity. He acknowledged that Jesus performed miracles, but his idea was that Jesus did it by magical powers that he had obtained in Egypt. And then he says he proclaimed himself a God. Okay, so he also knows that Jesus said he was God. So that is saying the miracles happen, but different explanation for source. Then we could go to Josephus, who was a Jew, and he gives a more neutral perspective on things. And he basically just says that that Jesus performed some type of incredible and paradoxical works. Okay, so he knows that those happen. He doesn't really comment on how that occurred. If we go to another Jewish source, more a religious Jewish source, the Mishnah essentially says the same thing as some of the Pharisees do, recorded in the gospel, and that is that Jesus performed sorcery, they call it, okay? And so for that, he should be arrested and stoned. Well, some of the Pharisees claim Jesus was performing miracles through the power of the devil, okay? So they're looking at that as it happened, but they're saying it's an evil source. We could look at a Christian writing to the emperor. So Justin Martyr wrote to the emperor, but he appeals to Roman records, the Roman records of Pontius Pilate, the Acts of Pontius Pilate. And he tells the emperor that these miracles happen, and you can confirm that by going to the Acts of Pontius Pilate, the records while he was there as governor of Judea. So apparently Pilate had recorded some information about miracles of Jesus happening. So there are all these different sources from different perspectives. But the thing that they share in common is that Jesus performed miracles. None of them dispute that. So people have got to decide for themselves how they think Jesus did that. Where is the power? But I don't think we can just discount that these happened. From archaeology more specifically, moving beyond these ancient documents, which, like we talked, they can be considered archaeological material in a way. But if we go and we break down some of the miracles, like say the pool of Bethesda, I think this is a great example. So the pool of Bethesda was in Jerusalem, and John gives some specific information about this in relation to the healing of this man who could not walk. And he talks about the pool of Bethesda having 5 stoas or 5 porticos. Well, when that was excavated, and it had been buried since 70 AD, they found that this was a rectangular structure with the 5th stoa going through the middle, dividing it into upper and lower pools. So that tells us John was there, in Jerusalem when that building was existing. But even more interesting is what happened after that. So Christians and other people had remembered the miracle of Jesus, the healing miracle that happened there. Well, when Hadrian got there, Emperor Hadrian, what did he do? He built a Roman temple over that, but he specifically built a Roman temple to Asclepius, the god of healing. So then that healing could be associated with a Roman god rather than Jesus. And in so doing,
Wow.
he confirmed the knowledge of that healing miracle having occurred there.
So 700 years before Jesus' birth, Isaiah prophesied about how Jesus would be crucified. And he says this, he said, "But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." And that is Isaiah 53:5. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Isaiah 53:7. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Isaiah 53:9. We also see prophecies of Jesus' death in the Psalms that were written about 1,000 years before. Correct me if I'm wrong. So, what artifacts have been left behind for us that show that Jesus was tried and crucified the way that the gospel writers described?
Well, we already talked about some of those first and second century sources that narrate briefly the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. But we have, first of all, evidence of Roman crucifixion being carried out in Jerusalem in the first century prior to 70 AD, just as we see recorded in the Gospels, and the way that they nailed people to the cross there is consistent with the biblical accounts. That is, through the feet and the wrists. And then they were able to take people and give them a proper burial if they wanted to. So it wasn't just that because you were crucified, you got thrown into a mass grave of criminals. No, we have recovered other burials that were crucified that were given a proper Jewish burial. So we know those aspects are consistent, but we can go to Rome to look at one of the earliest pieces of archaeological evidence for the crucifixion of Jesus. And this is something that was found on the Palatine Hill in Rome, and it's called the Alexamenos graffiti. And this shows a picture of Jesus on the cross, but they've given him a donkey head because they're mocking him. And it shows a Christian next to Jesus, and it says that Alexamenos worships his God. So Alexamenos was the name of this Christian that they were also mocking. So these Romans, who were pagans, polytheists, they knew about the crucifixion of Jesus, and they knew that the Christians worshipped Jesus who had been crucified. They weren't disputing that historical event. They just thought it was ridiculous that people would worship a God who had been crucified, because in Roman law, crucifixion was reserved for the worst criminals who were non-citizens, and they would never have a story about one of their gods being crucified. So that, I think, is pretty powerful evidence, because it's not a Christian artwork. It's a mocking of an event that they knew about, because they couldn't see how Christians could possibly believe that, or think that it made any sense. But in so doing, they're demonstrating to us that this is not any kind of propaganda, that it's just a common knowledge event.
Right. And like you said, it was not part of the Jewish train of thought that there would be a God that would die, that would be crucified in the manner that he was. That wasn't part of the religious idea or thought life or even expectation of the Jewish community at that time.
Right. Yeah. And even more so the Romans there, who were the ones that made that artwork. But Paul talks about that in Corinthians, and he says, with the two groups of people, essentially, that he often compares and contrasts that between Judaism and Hellenism, and he says for the Jews, the crucifixion is a stumbling block, and for the Hellenists, it's ridiculous, because it didn't fit the worldview or the religious views of either one of those groups.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So now all four gospels mention the tomb of Jesus, right? And so what are some of the evidences that we have for the burial and tomb of Jesus Christ?
Well, the Gospels get really specific on describing the tomb and the general location also. So we know that it was outside of the walls of Jerusalem at the time that Jesus was buried. Okay, so the walls of Jerusalem have changed over time, and they even changed during the first century. But that's the first criteria. And then it describes some details about the tomb, like it was in a garden. It was carved into a rock face, and it was a single chamber tomb, and then there was a burial bench for the body, and it was sealed with a large stone. So we know a lot of details about the construction of the tomb and the location of the tomb. This was a type of tomb used by wealthy Jews, but the difference between the tomb of Jesus and many of the other ones is that Jesus's tomb was just a single chamber, whereas the others were used by whole families, and so they became multi-chambered and had a lot of different people buried in them over time. Well, if we go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and we look at the history of that, okay, that was built in the 4th century by order of Constantine, but they did so after consulting with the local Christian leaders in Jerusalem about where was the tomb of Jesus, where was he buried, where was the resurrection, and they knew exactly where that was for two reasons. One, because there was a continuous Christian presence in Jerusalem since the resurrection, other than a few years when a lot of people left during the first revolt against Rome, but they went back. So they're not going to forget where that happened. It was a small city, and people lived there for generations and generations. Second is that Hadrian also built a Roman temple over the tomb of Jesus, and he built a double temple to Jupiter and Venus, which is similar to the double temple to Venus in Roma that he built in Rome near the Colosseum. Yeah. So he was trying to replace Jesus essentially with Jupiter, who was the top of the pantheon for Romans, and Venus, who he associated with his own family. Now, there are archaeological remains there, thankfully, and when Constantine had that church built, they did some preservation. But if you go there, you can see more than just one tomb. So there are other tombs in the church grounds that are from the 1st century, and that were tombs used during that time and of the Jewish type. But the one that's revered, you look at it, and it's been modified and built around, but it was a single chamber tomb carved out of the rock. It's called an archeologicale type tomb, and there's the original entrance is there. They carved the second entrance so you could pass through, but you go inside and the burial bench is still there. So it's fitting all that kind of criteria. Archaeological investigations discovered that area had been a quarry in ancient times, but in about the 1st century BC, it was converted into a garden and then used as a cemetery. So all of that stuff is fitting. It was outside of the walls of Jerusalem in 33 AD. Later on in the 1st century, there was another wall built farther to the north, and it became enclosed. So that's what confuses some people now, especially they walk in Jerusalem today. It's inside what's called the Old City walls, but those are not the walls from the time of Jesus. Those are from the Ottoman period, the 16th century AD. So it fits all the criteria. People knew about it. People wrote about it. It's the same type of tomb. It's the only single chamber tomb of that type in the Jerusalem area from the Roman period. Like I said, all the other ones are multi-chamber. So it's unique. There's an incredibly strong case for that being the tomb of Jesus.
Well, let's close out this little tour through your book with this last question concerning the book. And then I've got one more question that I want to ask before we end our time together. Paul makes it clear in his letter to the Corinthians that if the resurrection of Christ did not occur, then the Christian faith would be in vain, right? And again, we go back to the idea that miracles are miracles. You can't recreate a miracle. How do we know? What does archaeology have to say about the resurrection of Jesus Christ?
So we have two ancient sources outside of the Bible, first and second century, that discuss or allude to the resurrection. The most important one, I think, is Josephus, because he says that they reported 3 days later that he was alive. All right, so he knows the story. He doesn't say he believes it. He doesn't say he disbelieves it, but he is reporting it. And he, of course, lived in the first century, and he's writing an official history. So he's trying to give us the facts. So that's very interesting that he would mention that. Archaeologically, what we see is that there was definitely a huge problem in the Roman Empire because of the story of the resurrection, and they were trying to suppress it or get rid of it. And one piece of archaeological evidence comes from what's called the Nazareth inscription, which essentially corroborates Matthew 28:11-15, where the Roman soldiers are told that here's some money, go and spread the story that the disciples of Jesus stole the body, and if there's any trouble with the governor, we'll take care of it for you. So they knew the body was gone. They didn't know what happened. They didn't witness it, right? Josephus reports people said that he was alive 3 days later. But the Romans issued this Nazareth inscription, which was it was a new edict of the emperor, and it basically describes the type of tomb that Jesus was buried in, a stone sealed sepulcher tomb. And it says that if anybody steals a body out of one of those tombs with wicked intent, then they can get the death penalty. So it was this super extreme new penalty for taking a corpse out of a tomb, and that's not normally what people did. There were tomb robbers, but what they would do is they would go in and they would steal items out of tombs that they could sell. They didn't go and just steal bodies with some intent behind it to craft a story. So they knew that the body was missing. All right, so that's a big problem. Where'd the body go? And they had to then say this story that the disciples stole the body. Now, we can't really go beyond that archaeologically, but we can use our brains and think logically. How plausible is it that the disciples could have stolen the body of Jesus from that tomb with the Roman soldiers guarding it? And that itself would have been almost miraculous, because those stones are not easy to move. The stone sealing Jesus's tomb probably weighed about 2,500 pounds. So they've got to push this huge thing, and it's supposed to be sealed in some way also. So they've got to break that seal. They've got to move the stone out of the way and then go get his body and take it out of there, all the while not waking up the Roman soldiers. So there's this contingent of Roman soldiers guarding the tomb. They're usually pretty good at their job. So, how did they do all this? Use some special sleeping potion on the guys and then get a bunch of people together, break the seal, move the stone, take the body out, make it disappear, and then all have, the same perfect story that everybody else has, so that they can stay consistent. I mean, it would be the most incredible conspiracy. And then they die because they believe in that, which also makes absolutely no sense. Why would all of them, or most of them at least, we know most of them at least, died for their faith? Why would they do that? If they all knew that it was just this elaborate lie. 20 years later, 30 years later, in the case of John, almost 70 years later, more than 70 years later. So it that part of it doesn't make sense. So archaeology can take us so far using some logic and reason. It's the best explanation.
That's great. That's great. And we know that there are, I think, six other main naturalistic explanations for the empty tomb. And I think, from what I understand, all of them have really been debunked because, like you said, not only archaeology, but just basic reason tells you that those are not plausible. And there's so much that happened from the resurrection. You've got, I think it was N.T. Wright in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, I think is the name of it, goes into just the sheer magnitude of the change in culture from the Jewish life to post resurrection of Christ. And so, just all of that put together, you're right. The best explanation is that Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead.
And the effect it had changed the world forever.
That's great, because I'm going to read the how you close your book real quick, and then I'm going to ask you your last question, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
You close your book by saying this: rather than a mythical character, Jesus of Nazareth is actually one of the most widely attested personalities in antiquity, and the narratives in the Gospels have been confirmed as historically reliable accounts by ever-increasing archaeological discoveries. Although Jesus only walked those paths until AD 33 and was unjustly executed in a tiny province on the fringes of the empire, knowledge of his life and teaching rapidly spread across the vast Roman world and beyond. Centuries later, the ancient ruins, artifacts, and manuscripts continue to tell the incredible story. One last question: how has your faith been affected by your career?
I've been able to see all the evidence, at least from this field, and be a part of discovering some new evidence connecting to the Bible and to Christianity and the life of Jesus. And so it's just reinforced for me that what we believe is all based on fact and reality. And there's an overwhelming amount of evidence. And it's reassuring and it's confidence building, but even so, for me, I find it more just exciting, and I'm thankful that we have that too, and that people have the opportunity to learn about this and to seek the truth and then find all this evidence that's been left behind. They can use that however they choose to, but I think that it makes such a compelling case for what we believe in, and we don't have to be always thinking, oh, is my faith based on reality, or is it just some fairy tale, or is it just what some pastor or my parents told me? No, it's been confirmed time and again by many different disciplines, and we can have full confidence that what's written there is true.
Can you give a bit of advice for any teens that are listening that want to get into the field of biblical archaeology?
Yeah, I would just say start with reading some books and reading some articles, and try to be discerning though about what you read. Don't just go to anything on the internet, because there is a lot of bad information out there also. So maybe start with some books by reputable scholars who actually work in the field, and start to learn more that way. And then if you enjoy it, I would say go visit some museums, look at artifacts. And if you continue to want to pursue archaeology, I would try to go volunteer on an excavation. Really, any archaeological excavation. It can be in the U.S. You don't have to go overseas. Something local, just to give you an idea of what archaeology is like, to see if you enjoy the field aspect part of it, and then you can go from there. Study it if you see that's what you want to do, and go excavate in the Holy Land.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kennedy. We appreciate your time. I will say, if you want to get Dr. Kennedy's book, you can purchase it anywhere books are sold. Is there a preference for you, Dr. Kennedy?
No, I'd say whatever is most convenient for people.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you again for your time. We hope that the parents, teens, grandparents, and others who have young people in their lives will find a lot of tools and conversation material in this episode to be able to open up some interesting conversations with your teens. Thank you again, Dr. Kennedy.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.